Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're getting into some really fascinating stuff about conservation.
Yeah, protecting those amazing ecosystems we have on this planet.
Exactly. And we've been poring over some research and notes, and
Yeah.
honestly, some of the connections are mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah.
Like, did you know that deforestation can actually lead to both floods and droughts?
It's true.
Wild, right? And get this, even the tiniest creatures can play a huge role in the whole balance of things.
It's all connected. It's easy to think conservation is all about like far off rainforests.
Right.
But what we found is that everything's connected, like way more than you'd think. And what we do every day, even small stuff.
Impacts the natural world.
Yeah.
Big time.
Okay, so let's break this down a little. Let's start with deforestation. I feel like we hear save the rainforest all the time.
Right.
But what's really causing all this deforestation in the first place?
Well, from what we've gathered, it's complicated. It's not just about, chopping down trees for wood.
Right. Deforestation happens for all sorts of reasons. Clearing land to grow crops, making space for cities,
Yeah.
even just getting wood to burn for fuel. And all of that has a ripple effect. It impacts the environment in a big way.
Absolutely. And, one thing that really surprised me was how deforestation affects rainfall.
Oh, right.
The research mentions less rain A&D, more flooding.
Yeah, that's actually a thing.
How does that even work?
Basically, trees are like major players in the water cycle. Think of a forest as a giant sponge.
Okay.
It soaks up all that rainwater, so the water doesn't just rush away and cause floods.
Right.
And it gives it time to, seep into the ground. But when you take away those trees,
No more sponge.
exactly, the water just rushes over the ground.
Down in floods.
Yeah. And since the ground can't absorb the water anymore, things get drier over time. It's like
A double whammy.
exactly a double whammy.
Because they're messing with this, delicate balance.
Yeah.
And speaking of balance, the research also mentions desertification. What is that exactly? And how is it tied to deforestation?
Well, desertification is basically when fertile land turns into a desert.
Oh, wow.
So you take away the trees, the topsoil is exposed.
Right.
It gets blown away by the wind, washed away by rain, and all those nutrients that plants need, gone.
So you're left with, barren land.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Useless for growing anything.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah.
So we've got floods, droughts, desertification. How does all this actually affect, people, our lives?
Well, think about the stuff we need to survive. Food, water, clean air.
Right.
Deforestation messes with all of that. Less rain means crops fail.
Yeah.
Food prices go up, floods damage houses and roads. We're talking billions in repairs.
Wow.
And desertification means less land to grow food.
So people might even have to leave their homes.
It's a real possibility. And all this can even lead to conflict, people fighting over resources.
It's like one thing leads to another, like dominoes.
Yeah, exactly. A chain reaction.
And it's not just us humans. What about the animals living in these forests?
Definitely not. The research was clear about that. Deforestation destroys their homes, their food sources. It separates them from each other, so it's harder to find a mate.
It's like if someone suddenly bulldozed your home and your grocery store disappeared.
Exactly. It's a disaster for them.
It's a lot to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But the good news is the research also talks about how we're trying to protect the planet. They mention sanctuaries, parks, and these things called biosphere reserves. What's the difference?
Well, they're all about conservation, but in different ways. Sanctuaries are often focused on protecting specific animals, keeping them safe from hunting or habitat loss.
Right.
National parks usually cover much bigger areas, and they might protect unique geological formations, historical sites,
Oh, interesting.
as well as the wildlife. Biosphere reserves, though, they take a much wider approach. They aim to protect whole ecosystems,
Wow.
including the people who live in them.
That's really cool. You mentioned biosphere reserves. The research actually highlights this one in India, the Pachmari Biosphere Reserve. What makes it so special?
It's got this crazy mix of biodiversity. Imagine Himalayan species hanging out with species from the Western Ghats.
No way.
It's like a biological melting pot.
Yeah.
It creates this incredibly rich and diverse ecosystem.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And speaking of diversity, the research talks about flora and fauna. Can you remind us what those are?
Sure. It's just a fancy way of categorizing living things.
Okay.
Flora is all the plant life in a certain area,
Got it.
and fauna is all the animals. And the Pachmari Biosphere Reserve has some really incredible fauna, like this giant squirrel.
A giant squirrel.
Yeah, they can get to be over 3 feet long.
Okay, that's officially on my bucket list, giant squirrels.
Mm-hmm.
But with all this incredible diversity, the research also mentions endemic species. What are those?
Those are the ones you can only find in one specific place, like nature's limited edition species.
How cool.
They've adapted to thrive in those very specific conditions,
Makes sense.
which makes them super special, but it also makes them really vulnerable. If their habitat gets messed up, they're in big trouble.
That makes sense. And then there's the whole issue of species becoming endangered or even extinct. Can you explain the difference?
Sure. So endangered species are the ones whose populations have gotten so small that they might disappear completely.
Right.
Extinct species, unfortunately, are already gone. And it's not just the big animals we always hear about, tigers and elephants.
Yeah.
There are tons of smaller creatures, the ones we don't always think about, that are facing the same threats.
That's true. The research mentions this thing called the Red Data Book. What is that?
It's basically a global list of species that are in danger of going extinct. Scientists all over the world contribute to it.
So a warning system.
Yeah, exactly. It highlights the species that need our help the most.
That's amazing. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have to ask about bird migration. Those incredible journeys some birds make every year. It's not just about the weather, right? What else drives these migrations?
Weather plays a role, sure, but it's more complicated than that. They're looking for good places to breed, plenty of food.
Right.
Sometimes they're escaping harsh conditions. It's pretty amazing how they navigate.
It really is. It's like they have built-in GPS. But with all the challenges we've talked about, is there any hope for these migrating species and the ecosystems they depend on?
Definitely. There's always hope. And it starts with understanding that we all have a part to play. Even doing something as simple as recycling paper can make a difference.
Oh, really?
Yeah, recycling just 1 ton of paper saves something like 17 mature trees.
Wow, I had no idea.
It adds up. And then there's reforestation, planting new trees to replace the ones we've lost. But it's not just about planting any tree.
It matters what kind you plant.
Absolutely. It has to be the right species for that ecosystem.
So we're not just planting trees, we're planting the right trees in the right places. Are there any laws, like, to protect our forests? To make sure things are done sustainably?
Yeah, a lot of countries have laws and regulations about how forests can be used.
That's good to know.
Like in India, they have a Forest Conservation Act. It limits deforestation and promotes sustainable practices.
It's like a legal framework to protect both people and the environment.
Exactly.
That's encouraging. It sounds like there are things happening on both individual and government levels to protect these ecosystems. But before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, is there anything else you think is important for our listeners to understand about conservation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it's complicated. Conservation is a huge challenge, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
It takes a deep understanding of how everything's connected.
Yeah.
And a commitment to finding ways for humans and nature to live together sustainably.
That's a great point.
It's not about us versus them.
It's about finding that balance.
Exactly. You mentioned earlier that planting the right types of trees is really important for reforestation.
Oh, yeah. It's not just about planting any old tree.
Right. It's about keeping that balance in the ecosystem.
Okay.
Every species has a job to do. And if you plant the wrong kind of tree, you can really mess things up.
How so?
Well, imagine you plant a tree that grows super fast,
Okay.
but it's not native to the area, and it ends up hogging all the sunlight and water and nutrients.
So the native trees can't survive.
Exactly. They get crowded out, and that hurts the whole ecosystem.
It's like, putting a new player on a team without thinking about how they fit in with the rest of the players.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's not just about having a lot of trees.
It's about having the right mix.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important part of conservation, the human element.
Okay, how do humans fit into all of this? I mean, we've talked about how deforestation is bad.
Right.
But can we also be, like, a force for good when it comes to conservation?
Absolutely. The research was really clear about that. Even small things that we do every day can make a difference.
Really?
Yeah. Recycling paper, supporting businesses that are doing things sustainably,
Okay.
even just reducing how much stuff we buy.
So it's not just about big, dramatic actions.
Nope. It's about the choices we make every day.
That's actually pretty empowering.
It is. And of course, education is super important.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The more people understand how everything's connected, the more likely they are to care about conservation.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
But what about the people who actually live in or near forests? How does conservation affect them?
That's a really good question. And it's complex.
Okay.
The research mentions that these communities often have traditional knowledge about the environment,
That makes sense.
which can be super valuable for conservation efforts.
Yeah, I can see that.
But sometimes, the rules and regulations that are meant to protect wildlife can clash with the needs of those communities.
It's like finding that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
Protecting nature while respecting the people who live there.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to involve local communities in conservation projects.
Right, get their input.
Yeah. Their knowledge, combined with scientific research, can lead to better solutions.
Solutions that actually work for everyone.
Exactly.
So we've talked about plants and animals, but what about water?
Ah, yes. Water, the source of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How does conservation help protect our water resources?
Well, remember how we were talking about trees acting like giant sponges?
Yeah, regulating the water flow.
Right. When forests are cleared, the water runs off the land much faster, and it carries all sorts of pollutants into rivers and streams.
So protecting forests also means protecting our water.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
Everything is connected. But even with all the efforts being made, what are some of the biggest challenges facing conservationists today?
Well, habitat loss is still a huge problem. Humans keep expanding, and that means less space for nature.
Right.
But climate change is making things even more complicated.
Oh yeah, climate change.
Temperatures are rising, rainfall patterns are changing, and we're seeing more extreme weather events.
So ecosystems are being disrupted even faster.
Exactly. And that puts even more stress on already vulnerable species.
It sounds pretty daunting. Are there any, success stories?
Oh, definitely. There are amazing people and organizations doing incredible work all over the world.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Like in India, there's this program called Project Tiger.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. It started back in the 1970s when tiger populations were plummeting.
Wow.
They focused on protecting tiger habitat, cracking down on poaching, and working with local communities.
And it worked.
It did. Tiger numbers have actually increased in a lot of areas.
That's amazing. It shows that we can actually make a difference.
Exactly. But we have to be proactive.
So looking ahead, what are some of the key things we need to focus on, if we want a healthy planet for future generations?
Well, I think promoting sustainable practices is crucial,
Okay.
not just in forestry, but in all aspects of life.
So consuming less.
Yes, and being mindful of our carbon footprint.
Yeah.
Supporting businesses that are environmentally responsible.
It's about making those everyday choices.
Exactly. Taking public transportation instead of always driving, choosing products with less packaging, supporting local farmers.
It all adds up.
It really does. And of course, education is key.
Yeah.
We need to teach future generations to care about the environment.
Right.
And not just in a theoretical way.
Yeah.
We need to give them hands-on experiences.
So they can connect with nature directly.
Exactly. Imagine a world where every child has the chance to plant a tree, explore a forest, really understand how ecosystems work.
That would be amazing.
It would. It's about fostering that sense of wonder and connection from a young age. You mentioned earlier that humans can be a force for good.
Right.
So how can people get involved? How can they contribute to these efforts?
What can we actually do?
Well, there are so many ways. Volunteering with local conservation groups is a great way to start. There are also citizen science projects where you can help collect data and contribute to research.
Oh, cool. I like that.
And of course, you can always support organizations that are already doing amazing work.
Like donating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or spreading the word about their work. And don't forget about advocating for stronger environmental policies.
Like making our voices heard.
Exactly. Let your elected officials know that you care about the environment.
So it's about taking action on multiple levels.
It is. It's about realizing that we all have a part to play.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
From the science of ecosystems, to the challenges of climate change, to the incredible stories of conservation successes.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this part of our exploration, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation so far?
For me, it all comes back to that interconnectedness we keep talking about.
Okay.
From the tiniest creatures to the largest ecosystems, everything is linked. And what we do matters.
Our actions have consequences.
Yes, but they can also have positive impacts. And I hope our listeners are feeling empowered to make those positive changes.
To be a part of the solution.
Exactly. We've talked about the challenges, the solutions, how we're all in this together.
Yeah. It's been quite a journey so far.
It has. But where do we go from here?
Good question.
Yeah.
How do we bridge the gap between what we know and what we do?
Well, you know, what really struck me, and I hope our listeners are thinking about this too, is just how connected everything is.
We keep coming back to that, don't we?
We do, and for good reason. I mean, think about it, from the tiniest little microbes to those giant whales, from the air we breathe to the water we drink.
It's all part of this incredible complex web of life.
Exactly. And we're not separate from that web. We're a part of it.
So what we do affects the whole system.
It really does. Even small things. And that can feel kind of overwhelming, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's also empowering because it means we have the power to make a difference.
Okay, I like that. So it's not about reaching some far-off goal.
Right.
It's about constantly learning, adapting, making better choices. Choices that lead to a more sustainable future.
Exactly. It's a journey. And remember, conservation isn't just about protecting those far-off wilderness areas.
It's about the nature right here in our own backyards, too.
Exactly. Planting native flowers, cutting back on pesticides, creating little habitats for pollinators, being careful with how much water we use.
Those everyday things can actually make a difference.
They do. And it's not just about the environment. It's about that personal connection with nature. Think about stepping outside and hearing birds singing, seeing butterflies in your garden.
There's something really special about that.
There is. It reminds us of the beauty that's all around us and why it's worth protecting.
I think that's what will ultimately motivate us to make those changes we need to make.
I agree. It's about realizing that we need a healthy planet to be healthy ourselves.
So we've come full circle. We started with this idea of interconnectedness, and now we're back to it. We're all part of this amazing system.
We are.
And we all have a responsibility to protect it. As we wrap up this deep dive, is there one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
You know, I'd love for our listeners to imagine that they have the power to create their own nature reserve. What species would they protect? What habitats would they restore? What message would they want to share with future generations about our relationship with nature?
That's a great question. It really makes you think.
It does. It's about taking all this knowledge we've gained and using it to create a better future.
Well said. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into conservation. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some amazing ideas, and hopefully inspired you to take action. Remember, every choice you make, no matter how small, can contribute to a healthier, more vibrant planet. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep making a difference. Thanks for joining us.